My name is William King. I'm 36 years old. And until one Saturday evening in May, I believed something simple. Something my father taught me before I could even spell my own last name. Build quietly. Build with patience. The right things find you in their own time. That belief held for 36 years. It held right up until my mother-in-law lifted a glass of champagne in front of 300 wedding guests and humiliated me without ever once saying my name out loud. Here's the part none of them knew that night. 40 minutes before Vivian Harrington stood up to give that toast, a black Lincoln was already pulling out of a parking garage in Jackson, Mississippi, carrying a folder with my late father's handwriting across the tab. A folder worth more than every acre of land, every glass of champagne, every smug little whisper in that barn combined. $10 billion. They thought I had nothing left after my father passed. They had no idea what he'd left behind, or who he'd left it with. Before I tell you how a wedding toast turned into the worst night of my wife's life, let me take you back 3 hours, to a piece of land outside Greenwood, Mississippi, that's belonged to my family since before the interstate even had a name on it. It was the kind of May evening the Delta does better than anywhere else in the country. The heat had finally let go of the afternoon, left behind that thick, golden hour, when the light turns the cotton fields the color of caramel and the cicadas start tuning up like they've got somewhere important to be. My family's old hay barn, the one my father restored with his own 2 hands back in the 90s, had been dressed up for the occasion, string lights threaded through the rafters, long oak tables, the smell of barbecue smoke drifting in from a pit somebody had been tending since sunrise. I straightened my tie in a cracked side mirror that had been hanging on that same wall since I was a boy, and I told myself the thing I'd been telling myself for 3 months straight. Tonight wasn't about me. Tonight was about Essie's younger sister, Zora, and her wedding. And the last thing on earth I needed to do was make it about anything else. That had always been easy for me, staying out of other people's spotlights. My father used to say I came out of the womb already practicing patience. Most days, I took that as a compliment. I'd spent 15 years as an architect designing buildings nobody ever thanked me for by name, and another 8 quietly funding small rural schools nobody knew I had anything to do with at all. I liked it that way. A man doesn't need his name on a thing to know he built it. Essie found me by the drink table, laughed when she noticed I'd missed a button on my jacket. "You'd forget your own head some days, William King." She fixed it for me with that easy, polished confidence she'd always carried, the kind that used to make me feel lucky, and lately, more and more, had started making me feel small in rooms I used to feel steady in. I let it go, the way I let most things go that year. My wife had a way of making a room feel like it had been arranged just for her, for most of 13 years. I hadn't minded sharing that light. There was a version of Essie, years back, who used to fall asleep with her hand flat against my chest, like she was checking my heart was still going. I couldn't tell you exactly when that version of her went quiet. I only know that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped expecting her to come back. We took our seats near the front of the barn, close enough that I could see her mother's face clearly when Vivian Harrington rose from her chair, tapped a spoon against her glass 3 times, and waited for the room to settle. "Some girls," Vivian said, her voice carrying clean across the barn the way a voice only carries when it's used to being listened to, "marry for money. They marry for land." She paused a half-second longer than she needed to, just long enough for 280 pairs of eyes to drift, almost by instinct, toward me. "But my daughter, my Essie, she married for the heart." The room laughed. Somebody near the band whistled. Essie laughed loudest of all, squeezing my hand under the table like the 2 of us were in on the same joke together. I smiled the way a man smiles when the whole room is watching to see if he will. I didn't trust myself to do much else. That's when Essie's Apple Watch lit up against her wrist, angled just enough toward me that I caught the message a full second before she did. It was from her brother, Darius. 4 lines, glowing pale blue against her skin in the dim barn light. Told you he'd stay quiet. Phase 2 starts the second this wedding's over. The back 40 and the old parcels are as good as ours. I didn't move. I didn't say a single word. I just looked down into the champagne in my hand and watched my own knuckles go white around the stem of the glass. 2 weeks earlier, Essie had asked me, almost in passing, whether I planned on selling the land behind the barn, since it was just sitting there, not doing anybody any real good. I'd told her it wasn't for sale. She'd smiled, kissed my cheek, said, "Just thinking out loud, baby." I'd let that go, too. My father's voice came to me then, the way it sometimes still did, low and even, the way he used to talk on the porch after supper. Silence is not weakness, William. Silence is the strongest weapon you'll ever own, as long as you're not using it because you're afraid. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I set my glass down, careful, deliberate, and looked out across that barn at every laughing, satisfied face that had no idea what was already quietly in motion behind it. Because what Essie and her family had mistaken for 13 years for a husband who'd simply learned to keep his head down was about to turn out to be something else entirely. And the man already turning his Lincoln off Highway 82 toward the farm that very minute wasn't coming for the wedding. He was coming for me. A man can stand in a room full of people who claim to love him and still feel like the only stranger in it. That's exactly how I felt slipping out from under those string lights, laughter still rolling behind me like a wave I just managed to duck under in time. I told myself I only needed air. The barn was thick with bodies and barbecue smoke, and nobody questions a groomsman who steps outside for 5 minutes. Not even when that groomsman happens to be the bride's brother-in-law, the only black landowner in 3 counties whose family has been farming the same dirt since before most of the guests' grandparents arrived in the Delta. Behind the barn. The night had gone that particular shade of dark Mississippi does so well, thick with cicadas and the smell of damp soil that never quite dries out. Not even in May. I stood near the old equipment shed, hands in my pockets, and let myself breathe for the first time in an hour. That's when I heard them. I recognized the first voice before I even saw who it belonged to. My wife, Essie, and her younger sister Zora, the bride herself, still in her gown, the hem already gathering dust along the bottom, tucked into the shadows near the propane tank. Voices low, but not nearly low enough. "You need to move fast," Zora was saying, "before Attorney Monroe sends whatever paperwork he's been sitting on. Mama said he started getting things ready to transfer over to William last month. If that goes through before the courts settle anything, we lose our window." "Don't worry about Monroe," Essie's voice, flat, impatient, the edge she used when a conversation felt beneath her notice. "He's old. He's loyal to a dead man. Loyalty doesn't pay anybody's bills, Zora. William won't say a word. He never does." I should have walked away right then. Instead, I stood very still, the way my father taught me to stand when I was a boy hunting squirrel out near the bayou. Still enough that the world simply forgets you're standing there at all. A twig snapped under my boot. Just one. It was enough. Essie turned, quick, the way people turn when guilt's already sitting heavy on their shoulder. And in that motion, something slipped loose from the pocket of the light jacket she'd thrown over her dress, fluttering down into the grass at her feet. By the time she'd composed herself enough to notice, I'd already eased back into the dark beside the shed, my pulse going harder than I wanted to admit to myself. I waited until both of them had drifted back toward the lights. Then I crossed the grass and picked it up. A single folded sheet, soft along the creases the way paper gets when it's been carried around for weeks. Opened and refolded more times than its owner probably wanted to count. At the top, a law firm letterhead out of Jackson, Mississippi. Below that, 6 words that tilted the whole night sideways under my feet. Land Transfer Agreement. William King. I read it twice before I trusted myself to breathe normally again. I didn't understand all of it standing there in the dark. Not yet. But I understood enough. Somebody had been preparing legal paperwork with my name on it. And it hadn't been me. I folded it back along its own crease, tucked it into my breast pocket, right over my heart. The way you carry something you're not quite ready to look at straight on yet. I hadn't even gotten my breathing all the way settled before Darius found me. There he is. Darius Harrington had a particular way of walking up on a man, like he was doing him some kind of favor just by showing up at all. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a little too hard, held it there a little too long. William, my man, let's just be honest with each other tonight. All right, I said. My sister's daddy never liked you. You know that? Not from day one. Said you were too quiet for his taste. Quiet men make Harrington men nervous. Always have. He laughed at his own joke, the kind of laugh that wants company and doesn't much care whether it actually gets any. But hey, your daddy's gone now, God rest him. So what do you really have left these days? Be honest with yourself. I didn't answer. I'd learned a long time ago that some questions aren't really questions at all. They're just a man trying to hear himself talk in front of an audience of one. Darius shrugged, turned to head back toward the music, and muttered, not quite to me, not quite to himself. The way men talk when they've half convinced themselves nobody's really listening. Mama should have made him sign that power of attorney last year, while there was still a clean chance to. He walked off whistling something tuneless. I stood there with that piece of paper burning a slow hole through my jacket pocket, those 2 sentences ringing in my ears like a bell somebody had struck a little too hard. My phone buzzed against my hip. Unknown number. I almost let it ride to voicemail. Something in me said not to. Your father told me that if anything happened at this wedding, I should send this. Trust Monroe. He knows everything. I read it 3 times. Standing alone behind a barn that had belonged to my family for 3 generations, while 280 people laughed and danced not 80 feet away from me, none of them aware the ground under all of us had already started to shift. I knew that number. It belonged to Mr. Otha Reeves, a farmer out past Indianola who'd nearly lost 40 acres to a banknote 3 years back. The same 40 acres I'd quietly helped him keep, with strict instructions to my father's attorney that nobody, including Otha himself, was ever meant to learn exactly where that help had come from. If Otha had received instructions from my father, specifically for tonight, that meant my father had known something was coming. Known what, exactly, I still couldn't say. But he'd planned for it the way he planned for everything. Years ahead, quiet as a held breath. Never once tipping his hand before the moment he'd chosen for it. I reached into my pocket, not for the folded paper this time, but for the small brass key I'd carried on my key ring every single day since the morning we buried him. It didn't open anything I'd ever found. It never had. My father had pressed it into my palm 4 years before he died. His big hand wrapped clean around mine and said only this: "You hold on to this key, son. One day you'll need it to open what I locked away." I hadn't understood him then. I'd taken it for sentiment, the kind of thing older men hold on to when they feel time getting short on them. standing behind that barn, with a stranger's land paperwork in my pocket and my brother-in-law's voice still hanging thick in the humid air. Those words didn't sound like sentiment to me anymore. They sounded like a warning, set in motion years before any of us had walked into that barn. What I didn't know standing there was that the next knock on that barn door wasn't going to be another guest arriving late to the party. So let me ask you something, because I still think about it. If you found proof, in the middle of a wedding, that your spouse's family was already moving to take land that's been in your family for generations, would you confront them right then and there? Or stay silent and let the truth find its own time? The way I did? Drop a 1 if you'd have spoken up on the spot, or a 2 if you'd have waited it out like me. Because 40 feet from where I was standing, the truth was already turning up the driveway. And it was about to answer that question, whether I was ready for it or not. At exactly 10:36 p.m., headlights swept slow across the gravel drive. A black Lincoln Town car rolled to a stop right at the edge of the party, almost like it had been timed down to the minute. I knew before the door even opened who was sitting behind that wheel. I'd known the second Otha Reeves's text lit up my screen. Mr. Thaddeus Monroe stepped out in a gray suit that hadn't wrinkled once in 62 years of Delta heat. Exactly as composed as he'd looked at my father's funeral 5 months earlier. Exactly as composed as the afternoon he'd taught 8-year-old me how to tie a proper Windsor knot. In the back office of his Jackson firm, while my father signed papers I was far too young to understand at the time. He didn't drift toward the music or the cake table. He came straight for me, cutting clean through the crowd like the party simply wasn't happening. Stopped close enough that only I could hear him over the band still finishing out its set. William. His voice was even, unhurried, a courtroom voice, even at a wedding. Your father gave me very specific instructions. I was to open this in front of you only after you had lived through one public moment that showed you exactly who your wife's family truly believed you to be. He told me I'd recognize it when I saw it. He glanced once, briefly, toward Vivian Harrington, still glowing faintly from her own toast 20 minutes earlier. Then back at me. I believe tonight qualifies. He opened a slim leather case, handed me a folder. The same kind of folder, I realized, that had likely been riding in that Lincoln since well before the wedding ever started, which meant my father had set this particular clock running long before any of us had even walked into that barn tonight. It was the very transfer agreement I'd already seen a copy of, the one that had slipped out of Essie's pocket behind the equipment shed less than an hour earlier. Monroe had no way of knowing that. I almost told him. I didn't. Elijah King was not simply a farmer who happened to own some good bottomland, Monroe said, low enough that the dancing nearby hadn't yet noticed anything was wrong. Your father spent 30 years quietly building something most people in this state never knew existed at all. Agricultural land holdings across 4 counties, partnership stakes in 3 regional agricultural corporations, investment positions dating back to the early 90s, compounding the entire time, without a single soul outside this firm aware of it. He looked at me steadily. William, the trust your father left specifically in your name is valued at $10 billion. I heard the number. I'm not sure, even now, that I fully understood it in that first moment. Numbers that size don't fit easily into a man's chest while he's standing in his in-law's barn, with barbecue smoke still clinging to his jacket and wedding cake cooling untouched on a table 20 feet away. There's something I didn't fully understand about my father until that exact moment. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, the discipline to hold your full hand back, not out of fear, but because you understand that the right moment will do more work for you than the loudest argument ever could. My father had spent 30 years quietly practicing exactly that, without ever meaning to. So had I. That isn't all of it, Monroe continued, turning to a second page. For the past 3 years, that trust has been quietly funding every small farmer support program and every rural school initiative you've personally been running, William. Except none of it was ever coming out of your own pocket the way you believed. It was his money, moving through you the entire time he was still alive, and it hasn't stopped a single day since he passed. He turned the folder so I could see it for myself. 17 names, typed plain down the page. 17 small farms scattered across the Delta. Men and women I'd quietly helped over the years whenever the banks came calling. Otha Reeves's name sitting third from the top. Exactly where I'd have expected to find it. Every one of those notes, Monroe said, is now held under William King's name outright. Your father bought them out himself, one at a time, over the past 6 years. He never told you, because he didn't want you carrying the weight of it before you were ready to. He wanted you doing that work because it was right, not because you understood what was quietly standing behind you the whole time. Something moved through my chest I didn't have a clean word for. Grief and a strange, full kind of pride wrestling each other over the same small piece of ground. The way they'd been doing ever since the funeral 5 months back. I became aware, slowly, that the music behind us had stopped. Conversation near us had gone quiet, the way it does when a room senses something is happening before it fully understands what. Phones were already coming up out of pockets and clutches, the way they always do now. Everybody suddenly a witness, whether they meant to be one or not. My wife pushed through a knot of cousins near the cake table, her face already losing whatever color the candlelight had been giving it. The easy laugh from an hour earlier, nowhere left to be found. William, her voice cracked clean across my name. What is this? I looked at her then, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. And for the first time all evening, my hand wasn't shaking around anything. I wasn't gripping a glass like a man trying to physically hold himself together. I was simply standing. Steady. The same way my father used to stand at the edge of a field he'd just decided to buy. Like the ground itself already knew exactly who it belonged to. It's exactly what it looks like, Essie, I said, somewhere behind her. I caught Vivian's smile freezing somewhere between confusion and the first flicker of fear. The particular look a person gets when the floor they've been comfortably standing on for years quietly turns out, without warning, to have been a stage the entire time. And the curtain has just gone up in front of everyone they know. Monroe wasn't finished. He had never once in his life been a man to leave a thing half said. There's one more matter, he said, and something shifted in his tone that put the hair up on the back of my neck. That your father was very specific about including tonight. Of all nights. I turned toward him fully, and for the first time since the Lincoln had pulled up the drive, I felt the ground move again under my feet. Like everything up to this point had only been the warning shot before the real reckoning walked all the way through the door. There's a clause in the trust, Monroe said quietly, almost gently, the way a man speaks right before he hands you something he knows will hurt you and help you in equal measure. And after what I just watched happen to you at that table tonight, William, I believe you're about to need it. Monroe set his briefcase down at the corner of the gift table, the same table still stacked high with wrapped boxes meant for a bride who, only an hour earlier, had been the happiest person standing in that barn. "There's a clause in your father's trust," he said, loud enough now that he clearly intended for more than just me to catch it, stating plainly that if the heir's spouse, or her family, is found to have publicly humiliated or manipulated him during a documented period of personal grief, specifically in the months following Elijah King's death, they forfeit any standing claim against the estate, permanently and without appeal. He didn't mean the 10 billion. Essie never had any claim to that. He meant the house, the joint accounts, the parcel my father had quietly titled in both our names as a wedding gift, generous enough that neither of us had ever thought to ask why he'd done it. A murmur rolled through the crowd, the way wind moves through a wheat field, bending every head in the same direction at once. My wife's hand found my arm, fingers trembling against the fabric of my sleeve. "William, please, whatever this is, we can talk about it at home. Not here. Not like this. In front of everyone." I almost believed her. For half a second. That's the strange, stubborn thing about 9 years of marriage. Even standing in the wreckage of it, some old, tired part of a man still wants to reach back and protect what he used to have. There's a difference, I'd come to learn, between a person who wants to talk things through because they're afraid of losing you, and a person who only wants privacy because they're afraid of being seen. For 9 years, I'd mistaken the second for the first. Monroe didn't give either of us the chance to take it somewhere quieter. 5 years ago, he said, after Elijah suffered his first cardiac episode, your mother attempted to have him sign a power of attorney while he was still recovering, weak enough that he may not have fully understood everything he was putting his name to. He recovered. He never forgot it. From that point forward, he had a small camera installed in the main house. Not out of paranoia, William, out of the same patient caution that built everything you've inherited tonight. He turned a small tablet toward the gathered crowd and pressed play. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 5 years back in the corner of the frame, shot from a high angle in the front room of the King farmhouse. A room I knew better than almost any room on this earth. My father's old reading chair, visible just at the edge of the picture. Vivian's voice came through clear. Younger by 5 years, but completely unmistakable. Talking low and fast to a 25-year-old Essie standing near the window. "William is too much like his father," Vivian said on the recording. "The quieter he gets, the more dangerous he is. We have to move before he turns into exactly what Elijah is." Young Essie, on the screen, nodded along. Arms crossed tight over her chest, already in on it. Already learning the long patience it would take to wait out a man for years still to come. The barn had gone dead silent, except for cicadas drifting in through the open doors, and somebody's toddler fussing 2 tables back. 300 guests, and not a single one of them said a word. What that footage showed wasn't only a mother coaching her daughter. It was something that goes deeper than strategy. Triangulation, where one person quietly turns 2 others against each other, so the resentment never has to be claimed by whoever planted it in the first place. Vivian never had to call me an enemy to my face. She only had to make sure Essie did the calling for her. One small decision at a time, for 9 years. Essie's eyes went somewhere I recognized. That place a person goes when they're running the math in real time, trying to find an angle, any angle, still working the room even as the room turned. "This is ridiculous. The footage could be anything." Her voice cracked halfway through a sentence she'd already stopped believing herself. Then she went down to her knees, right there on the dance floor. The same floor where she'd taken her first dance as a sister of the bride not 2 hours before. Sobbing into both hands, her careful updo coming loose at the temple, mascara already starting to track down through her composure, along with everything else. Vivian's mouth opened, and for the first time in the 9 years I'd known her, Nothing at all came out of it. For a woman who'd never once been at a loss for the right toast, the right smile, the right performance for the right room, that particular silence said more than anything she could have managed to put into words. Darius backed toward the barn door, the color draining clean out of his face. The swagger he'd been wearing all night long, gone, like it had never once existed at all. An older cousin of Essie's family, a man I'd only ever known as Uncle Roy, who had sat across from me at every single holiday table for 9 years, without once asking me a real question about my own life. Passed close behind me on his way out toward the parking lot and muttered, just loud enough for me alone to catch it, "You deserve every bit of what's happening to this family tonight." I didn't answer him either. I'd run clean out of things I needed to prove to that particular side of the family. I looked down at the woman who, until that exact moment, I would have still called my wife. Still on her knees, 2 dark lines tracking down a face I had woken up beside every single morning for 9 years. And I felt something settle low in my chest that wasn't quite satisfaction. It sat closer to relief. The particular kind you feel when a wound you've spent years pretending isn't infected finally gets properly lanced. Marriage researchers have spent decades pointing to one behavior more than any other as the surest sign a relationship is already over. Not anger, not even infidelity, but contempt. Contempt means you've already decided, somewhere quiet inside yourself, that the other person doesn't deserve your respect, long before you ever decide to leave. Looking down at her, I finally understood something. The marriage hadn't ended in that barn. It had ended years before I ever got the chance to see it. "You don't need to apologize," I told her, and my own voice came out steadier than I'd expected it to. "You just need to remember that from this moment forward, you are no longer William King's wife." I turned and walked out past the string lights, past tables of half-eaten barbecue and a wedding cake nobody was going to bother finishing now. Out into the warm Delta night, where the cicadas hadn't slowed down for a second, like nothing at all in the world had just changed. Behind me, I could hear Vivian's voice finally finding itself again, sharp and panicked, calling out for Monroe, for Essie, for anybody left in that barn still willing to listen to her. Nobody was. What none of them understood yet, what I was only just beginning to understand myself. Standing alone under a sky with more stars in it than the porch lights back home ever let us see. Was that the hardest part of that night wasn't behind me yet? It was waiting 3 days off, inside a folder Monroe hadn't even finished opening, and on a small flash drive sitting quiet in a desk drawer, holding the very last words my father ever recorded for me. The morning after a man's whole life changes, the world has the nerve to look exactly the same as it always has. I stood out on the back porch of the King family farmhouse, coffee already going cold in my hand, watching the same sun come up over the same cotton fields it had been coming up over since long before I was born. The porch swing creaked under me, stubborn as ever. My father used to joke that thing had been creaking since the Eisenhower administration. Not one board of it had ever been replaced. Because some things, he said, are better left exactly as worn in as they've earned the right to be. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since 6 that morning. Essie, mostly. A dozen messages, then 2 dozen, swinging back and forth between apology and accusation. Like a woman still deciding which version of herself she wanted the record to remember. "Please, William, can we talk? You owe me a conversation after 9 years." I didn't owe her a single thing. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I let myself believe that without a trace of guilt attached. I didn't answer one message. I forwarded the entire thread, screenshots included, straight to Monroe, and went back inside to pour a second cup of coffee I didn't especially want, just to give my hands somewhere useful to be. 3 days later, Monroe called. "Your father left one more thing," he said. Without any of the ceremony from the wedding night, steady and plain, no different than usual when it was just the two of us on the line. A rural community development fund. $500 million, William. He wanted it used to continue exactly the kind of work you've already been doing out there for years now. The small farms, the schools. He simply wanted you to finally have the resources to do it properly, out in the open, instead of quietly bankrolling it out of your own salary the way you've been doing since you were 28 years old. I sat with that for a long moment before I trusted my voice enough to thank him. That same afternoon, I drove out to the family cemetery on the back 40. The very 40 acres Darius had bragged about claiming for Phase 2 only 4 days earlier. The same 40 acres that, as it turned out, had never once belonged to anyone but the King family to begin with. My father's headstone sat plain and gray under a pecan tree he'd planted himself the year I was born. The same tree Otha Reeves always swore was stubborn as Elijah himself, for refusing to drop a single nut before October, no matter how early the first frost came through. Monroe met me there, holding a small flash drive cupped in one closed hand like it was something fragile enough to need protecting. He recorded this about a month before he passed, he said. He told me not to give it to you unless I was certain you'd already lived through whatever this turned out to be. I am certain now. I drove home, played it that night, alone, in the same front room where a hidden camera had once quietly caught Vivian Harrington's true face on tape. 5 years before any of us had known enough to go looking for it. My father appeared on the screen, thinner than I remembered him at the very end, but steady, the same calm sitting in his eyes that he'd carried his entire life. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means they've shown you exactly who they are. I'm sorry it had to happen that way, son. I always hoped I was wrong about them. But I built a habit a long time ago of preparing for the version of events I prayed I'd never have to see. And I'd rather you walk in ready than walk in right about being wrong." He paused. He always did that right before saying the things that mattered most. "Now I want you to do what we always talked about doing together. Build for the people of this delta. Money was never the point, William. It's only ever been a tool. The real legacy is what a man leaves behind for the people who never had a single soul looking out for them. That's the only inheritance worth protecting in the end." I sat with that recording a long while after the screen went dark, the porch swing creaking faintly through the open window, even though nobody was outside sitting on it. I thought back, then, to something Uncle Roy had said to me on his way out of that barn 4 nights earlier. Not the bitter line about deserving everything that had happened, but something quieter, something he'd murmured almost under his breath, passing me a second time near the parking lot, like he hadn't fully meant for anyone to catch it, but me. "Your father," he'd said, "was so proud of you." I hadn't had room to sit with those words that night. I had all the room in the world for them now. Essie filed for divorce 2 weeks later. Her attorney tried, briefly, to argue some claim against the trust on her behalf. It took Monroe exactly 1 phone call and 1 unblinking reference to that footage to end the conversation for good. She walked away from 9 years of marriage with precisely what the prenuptial agreement she'd once fought to renegotiate, the week before the wedding, and lost, had always promised her. Nothing tied to Kingland, King money, or the King name. Vivian Harrington stopped showing up at the church socials she used to run like a second pulpit. Darius drifted out of the Delta altogether by midsummer. Men like him usually do, once a room stops laughing along with their jokes. I never went looking for either of them, and I haven't heard a word from them since. Some silences are worth letting stay exactly as quiet as they've finally become. Most mornings now. I walk the fields with the same patience my father always carried. Slow, unhurried. Like the land itself has all the time in the world and fully expects a man to match its pace. I still stop by Otha Reeves's place most weeks, mostly just to sit on his porch and argue with him about whose tomatoes come in better by August, which is a fight neither one of us has ever once managed to actually settle. Last fall, the rural school program my father had quietly funded for years finally got its own building dedicated out near Indianola. The kind of small, plain brick schoolhouse that won't make headlines anywhere outside 3 counties and was never built to. A young teacher named Naomi Calloway led the ribbon cutting that afternoon. She didn't know the full story behind who had funded the place. Not all of it. Not then. She simply shook my hand afterward and said, "Whoever built this understood exactly what these kids needed." I told her I'd pass the compliment along to the man who truly deserved it, and left it there. Some legacies don't need a name attached to them to be worth the building. I am no longer the quiet husband everyone in that barn assumed had nothing left to lose. I am William King, the last son of Elijah King, entrusted now with carrying forward a legacy that was never really about the size of the number Monroe read aloud that night. It was about everything that number was quietly built, for decades, to protect. In the closing seconds of the recording my father left behind, right after the part about legacy, right after the part about tools and inheritance, he added one final line, almost like an afterthought, the kind of thing a father says reaching for the door on his way out. "You don't have to be like me, son. You only have to do what you believe is right. This land will belong to whoever deserves it, and I trust you to know the difference." I am not silent anymore, not because I have anything left to prove. I've simply come to understand that the quiet years were never a season I was waiting to grow out of. They were the foundation everything afterward was always going to be built on. This story reminds us that silence has never once been the same thing as weakness. Not in a marriage, not in a family, and not across the long, patient years it takes to build something that actually lasts. Real legacy was never about the number sitting in an account. It is about what we quietly protect, for people who may never even learn our name. So if you've spent decades inside a long marriage, hoping your own sons or grandsons are never taken for granted the way William nearly was, take heart. Truth keeps its own timeline. Dignity outlasts performance every single time. And sooner or later, in this life, or simply in how we're remembered afterward, the truth finds its way to the surface, and it sets things right. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration. These are authentic human stories, shaped by real pain and real dreams. AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure, but the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Wynn. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Wynn. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.